Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome all of you to this 11th ANZSOG annual conference on the theme that you can see highlighted there, managing and hopefully triumphing in turbulent times. So before commencing official proceedings, it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Doyle to do a traditional welcome to country. Matthew, I might just say a few words about him because I saw him in action at a conference in this very place that ANZSOG collaborated with the OECD on, and also Prime Minister and Cabinet and the New South Wales Government. And I thought we should have him back for our very own conference. He's founder of the Plenary dance troupe. He's a professional musician, composer, choreographer and teacher. So it's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Doyle to provide a welcome to country. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Kamwe Budriago. Or if you come from across the Tasman, kia ora. Tadi balango niak. We acknowledge the guardians of the spirit of this land and welcome you onto the land of the Gadigal. My name is Matthew Doyle. I'm a descendant of the Murawari people who come from the far northwest of New South Wales, along with my Irish heritage as well, which I'm very equally as proud of. However, I was born and raised here on Gadigal land. The Gadigal are one of many clans that make up the Eora Nation, which cover the Sydney metropolitan area. It is customary in our culture, as it is with many other cultures, to acknowledge the traditional owners or the First Nations people on the land that we gather. So I do acknowledge the Gadigal and pay my respects to our elders and our knowledge holders, past and present. I'd like to welcome you with a piece on the Yidaki, most of you may know as a didgeridoo. In fact, it has about 40 different names. I can't remember all of them, that's too many for me. I'll tell you 3 other names though, see if you can say them. Yidaki, of course, is one. Can you say that? Yidaki. Second one is Larawa. And one of my favourite ones comes from North Queensland, that's Yigi Yigi. That's right. Now, of course, the didgeridoo is not a traditional instrument of the Gadigal people, but as our culture does change and adapt over time, it is now very much a part of many nations' traditional music right around Australia. Ungungamania, Talinarangun, Panyajimika, Chalkalania, which basically means g'day. Means we welcome you to our land, extend our hand in friendship and embrace you. I hope you have a great conference and a safe journey home as well. The piece I'm going to play for you is a contemporary piece, and it's about some of the unique fauna that we have in Australia. So listen out for some kookaburras, cockatoos, dingoes and a few others that I'll throw in there, and hopefully you'll recognise some of those. So hope you enjoy it.
Well, I think you can see and you heard why we got Matthew Doyle to give the welcome to country. For our part, on behalf of ANZSOG, myself, I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose ancestral land we clearly meet today, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So thanks again, Matthew, for a wonderful welcome to country. Well, it's great to have you all here. Conference takes a while to prepare. We know that it's not always easy to get the approval to pay the fees for conferences these days. Budgets are quite tight, and so we do appreciate all of you coming. I'm sure you're going to find that it was a very worthwhile experience, as our past conferences have been. But on matters financial, I should take this opportunity in particular to thank our conference sponsors, our principal conference sponsor, the Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, who've been our sponsor for a number of years, and we're very grateful to them. Those of you who went to the Patterson oration last night and heard Peter Shergold would join me, I'm sure, in thanking Telstra for sponsoring that event. And of course, the dinner tonight, which should be a treat. We have Blair Comley, Secretary of Premier and Cabinet here in New South Wales, and the sponsor is Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. So we thank them all very much. Well, as I observed in my introductory remarks in the booklet that you've got, the theme for this year's conference, Hyper-Government, Managing and Thriving in Turbulent Times, is one that really doesn't need much explanation for public sector managers, at least those of you who are Australian. The conference is motivated by an evident need for public servants to enhance their administrative and policy capabilities in a period of unprecedented change in their operating and authorising environments. And those of you who heard Peter Shergold last night and his theme of adaptive governance, would reflect very much on the need for that and for enhanced capability in our public sector in challenging times. And it's not about the phenomenon of so-called 5 prime ministers in 5 years. We almost had 6. Or even the unprecedented electoral losses of several first-term governments in Australia. And these are Australian experiences which find no equal across the Tasman, actually. But it also encompasses such important issues which are shared across the Tasman as demographic growth and diversity, rising affluence and the emergence of stronger divisions in social, political and civic values, the advent of so-called 24/7 media, the death of traditional media business model and the impacts these are having on both politics and policy development. And thirdly, the evolution of Westminster systems under more volatile and demanding political and social pressures, with Australia's Washminster hybrid, as it's coming to be called, posing significant challenges for the bureaucracy and its leadership. So at this conference, you'll be provided with expert analysis and opinion on the questions that need answers if we're to adapt in a productive way to the changes we observe. No one is better placed to help set the stage for this than Bill English, who is Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance in New Zealand, and also has responsibility for Housing New Zealand Corporation. He's well known to all of us at ANZSOG. He's a friend of ANZSOG. He's appeared at a number of ANZSOG events, including this annual conference on a few occasions. Bill was first elected to Parliament in 1990 as the MP for the Wallace electorate, later renamed Clutha Southland, and he served as the local MP for 24 years until he became a list MP under the MMP system. He has qualifications in commerce and English literature. So he's not only economically literate, he's literate. And my wife heartily approves of that, Bill, I should say, as an English literature graduate herself. But that's a rare combination. So Bill English has held ministerial posts in regulatory reform, education, health, revenue and finance, I think also infrastructure, and he was leader of the National Party from in 2001 to 2003. The only extra things I'd add that weren't on the official bio that might be of relevance and to people here is that he's also been a farmer, and he's also been a public servant with a short stint in Treasury. And I think having a taste of the farming world and also the bureaucracy, I think you can see evidence of that in Bill's keen interest in public policy and the mechanics of public policy, which has been to New Zealand's benefit. So without further ado, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming the Honourable Bill English to the podium.
Thank you, Gary, for the warm welcome, and thanks for the welcome to country. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And thanks for the opportunity to address this conference. Of course, for us, Australia is an offshore public policy laboratory where, because you have many jurisdictions and many smart people, anything we want to do is done very well somewhere here, and we just need to find it, which is one reason why I, along with some of the Kiwis in the audience, are regular visitors. And I'd also like to clear up any geographical uncertainty. I was at a dinner here last year, a business one, where we had quite an intensive discussion, speech and so on, and at the end of it, one of the attendees came over and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "It's just great, mate, to hear what's going on in Tasmania." So we are a different country. Can I say how much we admire the success of the Australian economy? I know here there is some anxiety, perhaps more than is warranted, but we are fortunate to be next door to the best performing developed economy. Also a country which is capable of bold public policy, and we watch with real interest how the NDIS unfolds. We don't want to pretend that much of what we do in New Zealand at a political or senior bureaucratic level is transferable or even that relevant in Australia. Our arrangements are unique. And where we can achieve things because of our size, that's good, but there are other things we can't achieve because we don't have the same kind of contestability of thinking that you have here in Australia. So the comments I will make will be of a more general nature against the background of the paper that Gary sent me, written by John Wanna, about hyper-government. And I want to avoid the temptation to engage in a process of public servants blaming politicians and politicians blaming public services. So my comments are more reflecting on the experience of being a Minister of Finance, an opposition politician, but particularly in the last 8 years, sitting and having the privilege of watching a very wide range of a full service government evolve through fiscal pressures and the kind of pressures that are outlined in John Wanner's paper. And it is, I think, a special opportunity that New Zealand ministers have, and a New Zealand Minister of Finance, because we have the whole thing, the whole gamut, the regulators, the defence forces, the service delivery, and an opportunity to watch dozens of organisations led with different styles, trying to achieve different things, and how they progress. I'd just make one point reflecting on the general political opinion set out in the hyper-government paper. And that is that we ought to dispense with the notion that people who vote against things we think we disagree with are somehow voting in an illegitimate way for non-legitimate and bad reasons. You didn't have to be a racist to vote for Brexit. And the reaction of the political class to Trump and Brexit and the recent Australian election simply exacerbates for the general public the sense that there's a gap between the governing class and the governed. Their opinions are legitimate by virtue of them having them. That is the core of democracy, and we won't resolve any of the problems around climate change, immigration, what Donald Trump means to the world, if we try to delegitimise the expression of public view, and I'll leave it there. When we think of thriving in an atmosphere of what's called hyper-government, which I might say is a bit more obvious in Australia than New Zealand, we are nice, quiet people, whereas the political environment here ranges from vigorous through to feral. So, but in that context, the change is us. And I think a conference like this is an opportunity to think about what can change in the government machine as a contribution to altering that environment or working out how to tolerate it. And there are some real challenges. So I think of government in a pretty straightforward way. And most of what it does reasonably well. A kind of 80-20 rule. We do a reasonable job of industrial scale monopoly production of services for those people who turn up to them. That can certainly be improved, and under fiscal pressure building up in Australia, it will be improved. We do a much poorer job of those who are most dependent on government. That is, those who know us most get the worst deal, precisely because the industrial monopoly version of service delivery doesn't work that well for them. And we shouldn't underestimate this challenge. I'm struck by the fact that the administrative state has now got so large, so complex, and so self-referential that even the people who run it doubt their ability to change it. Even the people who run it doubt their ability to change it. And that, in time, will become part of the gap between the governed and the political class, because there's people out there working hard, paying for the administrative state, and they want to know that its custodians are able to change the way it works to reflect the reality of people's lives today. And can I just give you one anecdotal test or example? The Auckland City Mission has done this fantastic thing which the New Zealand Public Service has not done. It's interviewed 100 families every fortnight to see what happens in their lives. And these are families all under pressure, needing the services of the City Mission. And they've distilled it into these case studies, and one of them is a fantastic example of a sole parent with a couple of kids and quite a bit of debt. And it maps out what happens with this woman over 2 weeks. And she encounters 23 agencies trying to solve her problem of debt and the related stress that goes with it. And I can assure you, for those of you who don't know Auckland, that encountering 23 agencies over a fortnight, catching buses, making appointments, somehow covering off what you're meant to be doing with the kids, doesn't leave you with a lot of resource at the end of it. It's probably a full-time job. And the woman talks about how one agency treated her with respect, sat her down, gave her a cup of coffee, knew a bit about her story, and actually solved her problem. And that agency is well known to New Zealanders from their advertising, Instant Finance, the people who charge 37% a month. So we are being outdone on compassion and care by the short-term rip-off finance merchants. And if I say to a public service, how do we solve that problem? How do we stop undermining the resilience of that woman by giving her 22 solutions that didn't work and leaving her with the 23rd one that made her problem much worse actually in the long run? We don't know how to solve that problem. And that's what I mean by the fact that the administrative state, the state machine, has become almost unable to be changed, although I'm going to give you a few general principles that I've found on reflection help us with a positive view of what can happen, what kind of dynamics need to come together to achieve some more change. And I hope we can do, and I hope you can do, we can get a bit further than invocations as politicians usually serve up for innovation and risk-taking. Because innovation is what other people should do, and risk-taking is what you're in charge of, not me. So the first one is pretty simple, and this is, in fact, I come up with a little formula that I keep in my head. Upside down, inside out government. Because it makes you think about how the world should be quite different. So the first one is focus on the customer. And I use the word customer because it irritates public servants. Because it's not a passive word. That's why they don't use it. Customers of what Dick Smith has, and Woolies, and Coles. Well, actually, customers are what we have too. They're the same people. And they don't change their mental state because they walk through our door instead of the door of Woolworths. They are legitimised, working, earning people with preferences, aspirations, and choices, which don't shut off when they encounter the monopoly state. And that focus on the customer needs to be pretty relentless because there are so many other pressures on an agency, state agency, and the people working within it. We publish this assessment of our public services called a PIF, which I don't even know what it means, but it's a very honest assessment. And what we find is our public agencies are much better at managing up than managing down. They're better at and more concerned about the minister, and a bit less concerned and less developed in their strategy around customers. And when you see it on one of those heat diagrams, it's quite stark. And it's going to take some changing, and ours is underway. But I can tell you one thing that is an enemy of thinking about customers, and that is talk about strategies, generalisations, and categories of people, because you can't actually provide service to any of those. So we now have a pretty straightforward measure for any question, for any proposition that comes forward, one of many questions, and that is which people where? Which people where? There's so much data now you can know. In fact, you have to try hard not to know their names. But which people where? I ran a bit of a test on this the other day. I was in a meeting with the CEOs or the secretaries of our six largest agencies. That is, the people who have direct control over about 20% of the economy. It'll be the same here. And I asked them to say, at the end of the discussion, tell me a story about something that happened last week that you're pleased about. And what I was pleased about is that each of them told me a frontline story about something that was changing for the results that we are trying to achieve. And I'll have to say, there would have been times in the past when they couldn't do that, and times when they weren't quite sure where the front line was. And a lot of it was quite detailed, actually, because that's what makes it different for customers. So the boss needs to know who the customers are and what the service interface is. So that's one, focus on the customer. Secondly, what difference are we making? And if I can sum that up in a brief slogan, we're here to reduce misery, not to service misery. We develop a codependency between public agencies and those who are reliant on them, where no one's quite sure what impact we're meant to be having and unsure how they would tell in any case. And what can come to pass is an environment of hopelessness. And by hopelessness, I mean people lose the belief that things can change. So we now require our agencies to demonstrate to us, how can you know what impact you are having? And it's quite a tough test, because you'll find that particularly in social service agencies, they don't collect information in that way, because their focus is a bit more on accounting for the funding and a bit less on accounting for the people. Well, we know you're going to use up resource, but what we're interested in is whether you changed lives or not. And if you joined the public service to change lives, then how do you know you did? And why should I believe your claim that the next 100 million will make any more difference than the last 100 million, which didn't work, and that's why you're back here looking for more? We reward the behaviour that services misery. Because if you didn't change it, you need more resource, don't you? And resources are only ever about a third of the answer. And of course, another challenge in understanding what impact you had is, what is the customer's measure of success? It could be that getting the kids to school is the measure of success in one household, and in the other household they're not quite so worried about that, they just don't want to be beaten up on Saturday night. And achieving that could change their lives. So how do you know you're making an impact? And ask the customer. And I've got caught out on this one. I gave a speech a few weeks ago. When we look at our bottom 1%, our 1% of highest risk kids, 600 a year in a cohort, 2 out of 10 of them get the 17-year-old qualification, NCA level 2 in our system, higher school certificate or something here, I'm not sure what they call it, which gives them gets them over the threshold to further training. 2 out of 10 of kids who are born into households with long-term dependency, a criminal record, and notification of child abuse or neglect. And I said to this audience, well, why don't we go, we have no idea how they do it. Which is true, we don't. We have no idea why that happens. We know a hell of a lot about why you fail, but we never asked about success. So I said, why don't we should just go and ask these kids. Because if you're 14 and you're on your track to NCA level 2 from that kind of household, you're a perceptive, resilient, clear-thinking kid. Well, this got reported in the local newspaper. I didn't realise there was a reporter in the room. So I've got a bunch of kids who volunteered. So they haven't rung my office or anything. It just appeared in the next edition of the paper, these 14 or 15-year-olds from out in Lower Hutt. And they said, well, we'll tell them. So we rang them up and I'm going to go out and find out. and pass it on to the Ministry of Education. So focus on the customer, what impact are you having? And the third one is the learning loop. You know, it's amazing how persistent and unchanging our problems are. It doesn't matter how much technology, what's happening in US politics, what airfare discounts you can get to Bali. Some things never change. And one thing that doesn't change much is public services, social services don't learn much. Individuals do, but institutions don't. So if I go and ask, what do we know from 30 years of dealing with family violence? The answer is we don't know how to deal with it, which of course doesn't stop us spending hundreds of millions a year trying to do something. And one reason is because these problems are difficult. Another reason is because we don't build on previous learning. We don't have systems that allow us to say we learnt that and it didn't work. We tried that and it did work. And I've had the amazing experience of seeing what happens with agencies when they start learning and realise they don't just have to cycle the same old analysis endlessly, which is one reason there's so much unfulfilling policy activity in public agencies, because it's just reciting the same characteristics of misery, the same measures of the same problem that we've talked about for 30 years, and the same sort of sense of vague hope that this time something might happen. Well, we need learning loops that ensure it does happen, that we actually stop, and the most important thing is stop doing dumb stuff. Learning loops tell you the easiest what doesn't work. And when it tells you that, you should just stop doing it, because it's not your money and you're making no difference. And it frees up resource to ask the harder question, okay, what is going to change a cycle of violence in this family? Or a cycle of educational failure in a community? So the learning loop, in my view, is absolutely critical, because too often policy discussions are framed as if we know the answer. And almost certainly we don't, because if we did, we would have already done it. And we would be spending 30% less than we are, because we would have fixed it. If I believed every claim I've heard in the last 8 years, sitting in my office with people bidding for billions, we'd have no problems on earth. Everything would have been solved, and we'd have no public service because we wouldn't need them, which I suspect wasn't what they were aiming to achieve. The last one, general principle, is transparency. Public institutions define themselves in a couple of different ways. The institutions they service, schools, hospitals, defence forces, police forces, the professional groups who run them, and often the actual profession, school, doctors, teachers, etc. But just as critically, the information they control. And one thing that will certainly change in the next 5 years is this. Everyone can know anything, anywhere, now for nothing. So knowing things has stopped being a specialist activity. What you used to need a PhD to spend 2 years on in the Department of Statistics will be able to be done in 2 seconds by the machine and with the algorithm that accesses the data. And we already have tools that take processes that I know used to take 2 years and come to not much, collapse it to 2 hours, and with clear decisions. Not perfect, but a long way better than flying blind the way we used to. So the tools of knowledge are being democratised rapidly. And that means hiding stuff is going to get hard. And so it's better to get on the front foot and hide everything in plain sight. So I'm a great believer that transparency does 2 things. One is it improves behaviour in the public service. That is, if everyone can see what you're doing and how you did it, you'll behave differently. And the other piece of behaviour it changes is people stop spending a lot of time managing impressions. The public like hearing about failure. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it means they think you're honest and you know what you're trying to do. We've been through a number of these exercises, and I must compliment the New Zealand Public Service on the openness and resilience it's shown in the face of transparency. We publish, as I said, the internal assessments of departmental performance. Recently we started publishing our major projects report, every large project, currently 36 of them, 4.6 billion, with our own red ratings. So we rate ourselves red and publish it. I can tell you ministers now read the major projects report, and that is better than any assurance system you can buy from a consultancy. And chief executives show up to meetings about how to solve the latest problem with the contract with the IT vendor, of which, there's an endless stream when you sit in my office. And that transparency also shows where there's fat in the system. Your system will have a lot of fat in it. It's had a lot of money for a long time. And the transparency will help the public understand that in fiscal constraint you can provide better services, because that will be a good way to get through it. And the transparency also forces, in my view, a stronger sense of purpose, which of course is something pretty critical in a public service, because a sense of purpose isn't forced on you. I think we all, politicians and public servants, worry about restructuring. The worst kind of restructuring is the one that doesn't have a purpose. We've tried to be very clear about setting a sense of purpose, and then the reorganisation follows on from behind it. But if you're clear about what you're trying to achieve, open with the public about whether you're achieving it or not, it gives a great deal more integrity to the processes of change, which, if they go wrong, can use up enormous goodwill and energy in a public service. So we're trying to apply these principles at the moment, in particular, to a process called social investment, which has had a bit of media coverage here just in the last couple of weeks. And that's based to some extent on finding the story that gets a public agency to do what we want them to do, because there's nothing public agencies have to do. They're not going to go out of business because their competitor came up with a better way of running prisons or being a Ministry of Education. But what we found is a powerful motivator is using data, and in our case actuarial processes, to show what happens in a life. That is, to take the concept of focusing on the customer and make it real. So when people understand that this child born into a household with these characteristics has a predictable life process, which, as it happens, will mean they cost $1 million by the time they're 35, then anyone would feel morally compelled to do something about that. When they can see that this 23-year-old woman with depression and mild schizophrenia looks cheap this year because we pay her a very small benefit, but she will be in our system for another 42 years before she goes on to national superannuation, then you feel morally obliged to do something about it. So we're just deploying the tools of linked administrative data sets, and we've got a pretty comprehensive one, and a strong data analytics capacity, which we need to build up. And if anyone here wants a great lifestyle at a somewhat lower salary, and as a data scientist, then please talk to me later, or Andrew Kibblewhite over here from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and a strong performance framework. So the data tools and a performance framework that is totally focused on those customers. And I see New South Wales government has got a set of results, ours are somewhat similar to theirs. But for instance, in the case of welfare reform, we have a chief executive whose responsibility it is to reduce the welfare liability. So rather than benefit expenditure being a forecast item, it's now a performance measure. And it leads us to ask a lot tougher questions, to which we often don't know the answer. Such as with the case I mentioned before, the 23-year-old woman. In fact, someone gave me this idea yesterday. Why can't that person get the same kind of support as a professional rugby league player who gets an injury? What is it about the focus that sports teams bring to getting their player back on the field that we could replicate with everyone, in our case of around about 170,000 core long-term welfare dependents, many of whom want to work, but many of whom are where they are because we certified them as hopeless and left them for 20 years. So these are questions that you need a pretty strong framework to force you to ask, and an even stronger framework to force you to answer. Because if we could avoid it, we would. That's why we have avoided them for 20 years or more. So just the final point. One reason this kind of exchange is so valuable is because New Zealand and Australia in the next 20 years are going to have choices few other developed countries have. And that's because most of the developed world is now dealing with a toxic mix of fast ageing populations. The population of Germany is starting to shrink as we speak. Fast ageing populations, very high levels of public debt, to a large extent as a result of the global financial crisis, and trapped in low and uncertain growth. And in the past, fast growth is what's fixed the other problems post-war, through the 80s, 70s and 80s. So their choices are very limited. They won't have the option of providing security to the most vulnerable because entitlements will be at risk. They won't have the options of significantly lifting the incomes of low-income workers or significantly increasing health services and the intensity of education where it's really needed. Australia and New Zealand will. And with the new kind of tools that are available, we have a fantastic opportunity to change lives. Thank you.
Well, I suppose the first question that occurs to an Australian sitting in the audience hearing you talk about transparency, feedback loops, risk-taking innovation is how the political class in New Zealand responds to risk. I mean, one of the big issues I think that we talk about in Australia is public servants are often encouraged to take risks, but the political process and what we call sometimes, rather coyly in ANZSOG, the authorising environment, isn't all that supportive of risk-taking in the form that you talked about. I mean, in a sense, you've given a talk about good process, learning from failure. We had Peter Shergold last night giving the Patterson oration. He's written a report on the pink bats fiasco in Australia called precisely that, learning from failure. Some perspectives from you on I suppose, the position of a minister in relation to a process that involves experimentation and learning, and inevitably, therefore, things going wrong and the public finding out about it.
Well, it's hard, no doubt about that, and I don't think we've found any particularly magic answer. It's just vital when there's problems that there's political support for the people who are somehow caught up in that, including for ministers who get caught up in that. I think the best way is, well, I think the one thing we're doing which is which reduces the opportunities for the cover-up or the big reveal is to just publish the stuff so that in New Zealand now, you can't have a big reveal story about projects, IT projects. Well, it'd be pretty hard, because whatever problem comes up, we can say, well, we told you about that 6 months ago. And of course, journalists don't read all this stuff. That's what I mean about hiding in plain sight. They're busy, you know, so it puts you in a stronger position. But as I think we all know, the risk management is a highly prioritised skill in the public service, too prioritised in my view, but I can see why it happens. So I think over time you've just got to try and take some of these steps, like tell the public this might fail. Politicians can play a key role in that. Publish where you can, be as transparent as possible, and it will reduce the sense that everything has to be managed. And over time, it does change behaviour. I mean, New Zealand, we have the Official Information Act is pretty broad and pretty inquiring. It has led to the practice of all cabinet papers being released pretty soon after cabinet. A lot of papers get released before cabinet makes decisions, which pushes you in the direction of saying, well, why don't we just have a more open, transparent policy process? Take people through the logic. And we've had a couple of successful runs at that. When we increased GST, by the time it actually was officially done, it was not controversial, because we'd been through a long, open process, publishing working papers, forced us to be consistent about our logic. You get better behaviour out of politicians with transparency. I know it might be hard to believe, but you do. And all of those things sort of help shape the environment, but you're never going to get rid of complete risk aversion.
Yes, I thought, the tax issue is quite interesting, because both countries have been through a process of tax reform. Both started in similar ways. You had your tax working party that did the work. We had the Henry Review and so on, but we ended up in different places. Do you think, you made the comment about the Australian political scene sometimes being a bit feral and so on. Do you think the lesser degree of feralness in New Zealand helped on the tax thing, or just that you worked harder at public education?
Well, look, that's sufficiently different that you can't compare. But I'd make a general point I'd make is that with the kind of hyper processes of social media and the way that you can get intense peaks around an issue within a day, I can't hold it more than a few days, but it goes like that. It makes it, in my view, even more important to hold shape. So, we've been doing, just give you an example, we've been the last country on earth, I think, to have a state social housing monopoly run by the government. And in New Zealand, it's been a sacred cow. So we've gone through about a 5-year process to get to where in the next few weeks we'll actually sell off some of our state houses, and we've created a market, so there'll be a lot more participants for existing or new tenancies. Now, at times there's been fairly intense opposition to that, and it's forced us to be really clear about what we're trying to do and why, so that when the tenant is lying down on the road in front of the bulldozer, you've got an explanation where the public think, oh yeah, we've heard that. Yeah, that's sort of fair enough, but they hope they're listening to this person. So yeah, all this pressure means, I think, that the policy logic has to be really clear, and if the politicians are convinced about it, they'll hold shape, and then you get points for getting through those pressure times.
Would it be fair to say that this is a relatively new insight from government in New Zealand? That, you went through a process of what was called Big Bang approach to reform, and at the time I remember in Australia hearing Paul Keating make an unfavourable comparison when the backlash occurred, and Paul said, I remember at the time saying, well, the difference between New Zealand and Australia is we brought the public with us. Right? Do you think there's any truth in that? And do you think what's now called radical incrementalism has been part of a political learning process in New Zealand, perhaps prompted by the UMP political regime that you've now got?
well, in the first case, that was remarkably complimentary from Paul, really, compared to what he might have said. Look, I think people work to the times, and we've just had a different set of circumstances than New Zealand in the 90s or Australia in the 2000s. So in the 90s, in the late 80s, the real threat of, currency reserves ran out and the whole place looked like it was falling apart. So it had an environment where things had to happen fast and did. And of course, there were political misjudgments along the way and a backlash that changed the whole political system. In the 2000s, and big difference between Australia and New Zealand is we had decisive events where the public were were grateful for continuity and stability, and therefore had a bigger tolerance of change. So they were a big recession in 2019, and the Christchurch earthquakes, which have disappeared out of the public view, but they're costing 20% of GDP to rebuild Christchurch, and the government has put in 9% of GDP. We've had to fund that in the last 6 or 7 years. So it's just quite a different mood. In Australia, you just had 25 years of relentless success and compound growth in incomes. It's pretty hard to persuade people there's a problem. I mean, they might, they'll hit a wall somewhere maybe, but much as, right in the deepest recesses of our heart, we wish it would happen, it hasn't.
I remember going to a conference in Auckland, and the focus was how could we close the productivity gap with Australia. And I remember saying to the New Zealanders present, relax, we're closing it from the other side. Just a matter of time, and that seems to be borne out. But what about the public service? You've made a number of comments about the public service. What's your view of how they can best help? There's a bit of a debate in Australia about whether our public service maybe have become a little bit too permissive, a bit too reactive, too much focused on implementation rather than putting up ideas and helping government with good ideas for public policy. How do you read the situation in relation to the minister versus the department, if I can put it that way, and their joint efforts to get a better future?
Well, look, I couldn't generalise about that. I mean, it's always going to be pretty tense. I'm a bit of a believer in the power of a good idea and the power of a good story, whether you're the politician or the public servant. And what I've found works and where we get real progress is where the public agency or agencies have a clear enough idea about where they're headed that in a way it sets the boundaries for the politician. So just by way of example, we've introduced, or the public services, New Zealand Public Service is very resilient, impressive bunch of people, just for those of them who are here.
It's quite a lot.
It's quite a few. They brought in these 4-year plans, which just that exercise of its own gets them a bit more focused on what their business is. These are perpetual institutions, so they should actually have 10-year plans. They don't face revenue fluctuations like normal businesses do, right? You're not standing behind the counter in the dairy worried about whether the passers-by are going to walk in. You're being force-fed customers, basically, and revenue. So you should have a 10-year view, particularly about your human capital in your organisation. What are the skills you're going to need? What are you doing about developing those? That's nothing to do with the politician. And in New Zealand, we're banned from thinking about that legally, and I presume it's the same here. So I've just found when agencies are clear about that, everyone behaves better. One of the first early exercises we went through was with one of the hardest ones, and that's defence. Where the historical pattern of discomfort between politicians and the defence forces and the sort of unpredictability of the whole thing, I felt it was turning out to be fiscally expensive. So as a finance minister, my preference is, and I think others are the same, you want predictability as much as anything. So we went through a very difficult exercise of looking at the 200 units of activity and taking out a lot of savings by collapsing the 3 systems into sort of 1.5. And now we've got a 10 to 15 year horizon. We have a very clear, pointed discussion about what capability we want, and we have to pay the bill. So they know we're going to be honest about what it costs, and they have to be honest about what it's going to cost when they want a new piece of kit. And in my view, it's greatly improved. So, and other agencies are all going through similar processes. So you can set the boundaries. If you think the politicians are out of control, clarity by the public agency, particularly longer term clarity, means you can deal with the whimsical fluctuations of the short term egotistical people that we are.
We often have an incoming government in Australia decrying, that the public service doesn't have the skill set and so on that's needed. I get the impression in New Zealand that hasn't been an issue, or you've been working on it. Any views about, were there issues where you felt the public service needed to skill up more to do what you wanted to do?
Yeah, all the time. And it's just because, just because when these things take time, right? So we, in New Zealand up to 2008, there was just a lot of money, so the skill set was a bit more orientated around there being a lot of cash in the system. And then it had to change pretty quickly. And it did change reasonably quickly rather than pretty quickly. But looking ahead, often it's depends what you're focused on. So we spent a lot of time on better capital management. Well, the level of asset management expertise in the public sector used to be a bit thin. It's grown pretty fast. We see remarkable shifts in people who used to administrate capital and now manage it. Same people, just better incentives and more clarity. Out ahead of us, if there was one area where I think you should be thinking, the traditional policy skill set is going to become redundant in 5 years. And in New Zealand it's going to become redundant in 2 years. The kind of generalist who wanders around thinking at a high level, waste of time. And I'm a generalist, go into politics. If you can't do something useful. So and by that I mean there's a great deal more certainty with the data about a whole lot of stuff where we used to speculate. And you could contest ideas. Well, now we can actually know which people where and what stuff's happening to them and what might change it. We'll not know for sure, but you can test it. So in that sense, policy's a commodity. My 12-year-old can go and print off world best practice from the OECD website if he wants to, and did, to prove the point.
That's the secret of New Zealand's success, obviously.
Well, they do have profound insights, these kids, because they're not, meshed up like we are. So that skill set has to change, because I think the coming skill set is, and we're struggling with this a bit now, when we apply the investment approach and make it the system instead of just innovation, we don't push it off down the innovation cul-de-sac, because innovation just means no one has to take any notice of this. When you make it the system, it's how they get their money, then they take notice. When you apply the investment approach and take it pretty seriously, it leads you pretty quickly to what sounds like an esoteric issue but matters, and that is, how do you create better solution finders? Okay, so we've got big chunks of liability where it's now become clear 2 or 3 people are the bottleneck through which all solutions relating to 60 billion of liability have to flow. Well, that is unsustainable. So that means the organisation has to change, because we are not going to find 60 billion worth of solutions even if it's, Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton and some Nobel Prize winner. They're just not going to be able to do it. So it's the institutional incentives and economic skill where you've got the data tells you to do something and you agree that's what you should do, because that takes a process. There's plenty of value judgments to be made. And then you've got to say, well, how do we organise to achieve it? So what we are doing, and others do the same thing, we're not doing anything unique. For instance, for our complex families, we've just built an alternative system, because actually it's very difficult to get health, education, welfare, justice who are big industrial monopolies to coordinate around customised services for complex individuals. It's just almost an impossibility. So we're just building a different delivery mechanism out alongside that system. And it will start responding because it sees the competition for cash. And in New Zealand we have the benefit, and it is a real benefit, of the whole sort of Māori world view and alternative structures and semi-constitutional role. And that allows us to experiment in a much more acceptable way than may be the case here.
Well, I think we've used up our time. I'm sure everybody can understand why we had Bill English speaking to us tonight. I think we can also understand why the good things that are happening in New Zealand aren't happening by accident. Leadership does matter. If you're listening really carefully, you might have heard Bill say that he thinks New Zealand's 3 years ahead of Australia.
I didn't say that.
So could I get you all please to join me in thanking very much the Honourable Bill English.
Thanks so much, Gary.
Well done. Well done.